Okay, so you want to own a funeral home. Picture the building, a converted Victorian on a quiet residential street, heavy curtains in the windows, a carefully maintained lawn, a place that has operated without interruption for 60 years and will operate without interruption for 60 more. You own the most recession-proof business in any zip code in America. Demand is guaranteed by biology. It has never declined, not once, not during a financial crisis, not during a war, not during anything. You do not run promotions. People do not comparison shop. They come to you in the worst week of their lives and pay what you ask, because they are not customers. They are grieving. That is the picture. Here is what the picture leaves out. The refrigeration unit is 12 years old. The hearse has 184,000 miles on it. There is a state compliance audit scheduled for next April. And buried inside the pre-need contracts you inherited with the building is a financial structure that almost nobody explains to new owners, which we will come back to, because it turns out to be where a surprising amount of the real wealth in this industry actually hides. The death care industry processes roughly 3.3 million deaths per year in the United States, according to the CDC, and generates somewhere between $19 billion and $23 billion in annual revenue. Most funeral homeowners are not particularly wealthy. Whether a funeral home can actually build real wealth for its owner and exactly how that works is what this answers. The answer has almost nothing to do with the funeral itself. Before any of that makes sense, a funeral home is not one business. It is three, and which version you are running determines almost everything about your margins, your daily workload, and your ceiling. The first is the independent at-need operator, a home that serves families at the moment of death with no advance arrangement required. A family calls you when someone has died. That death is called a call, which is the industry's fundamental unit of volume. One complete funeral service rendered to one family. You arrange the service, handle the body, sell the merchandise, and collect payment. The NFDA, the National Funeral Directors Association, estimates that somewhere between 75% and 80% of all funeral homes in the United States are independently owned, and the average independent handles somewhere between 75 and 200 calls per year. Call volume is the most important number in any acquisition conversation. Read that again because every seller already knows it. The second model is the independent with a crematory attached, what the industry calls a combination unit. This home owns its own retort, which is the industrial furnace chamber in which cremation is performed, and captures cremation processing revenue internally rather than routing it to a third-party operator. That distinction is becoming more consequential every year for a reason we are going to reach. The third model is the corporate-owned funeral home, operating under a local name. The family portrait stays on the wall. The longtime staff stays at the front desk. What the arriving family is not told is that this building is now a subsidiary of Service Corporation International, the largest funeral home operator in North America, running approximately 1,900 funeral homes and 500-plus cemeteries under its Dignity Memorial brand and listed on the New York Stock Exchange. That third model is the one that explains where the real money goes. The first model is the one you are most likely to buy. Now let's talk about what that purchase actually costs. If you are building from scratch, a funeral home is not a standard commercial build. The preparation room, the room where bodies are received, embalmed, and stored before services, requires specialized ventilation, drainage, and refrigeration systems that do not exist in ordinary commercial real estate. New construction runs between $1.2 million and $3.5 million to build and equip, depending on market and scale. Most experienced buyers skip new construction entirely and acquire an existing home, because what you are actually purchasing is established call volume, the steady flow of families that chooses your address over the 1-6 blocks away. Industry brokers typically value funeral homes at somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000 per annual call. A home doing 100 calls per year might trade at between $500,000 and $1 million. A home doing 200 calls per year at between $1 million and $1.8 million. The building is secondary. The flow is the asset. Then the costs begin to stack. First, the preparation room equipment, embalming tables, aspirators, injection systems, and the chemical supplies they consume. If the room is dated, budget $30,000 to $90,000 to bring it current. Second, refrigeration. Bodies must be held below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and commercial funeral-grade refrigeration units run $8,000 to $20,000 each, and you will need more than one. Third, the vehicle fleet. A new commercial hearse runs $55,000 to $130,000. A first-call vehicle, the transfer van used to move a body from the place of death to the preparation room, adds $40,000 to $75,000. Annual embalming chemicals and consumables run $8,000 to $22,000 per year, depending on call volume. Here is the part nobody tells you about licensing. The American Board of Funeral Service Education, the ABFSE, sets the national standards that every state enforces. A 2-year associate's degree in mortuary science, a supervised apprenticeship, and a passing score on a state board examination. If the licensed funeral director on your staff resigns, and they do resign, you are legally prohibited from operating until a licensed replacement is present. The business you are buying cannot function without a specific credentialed human being on the premises every single day. One departure, one health emergency, one unexpected exit, and the doors cannot legally open in the morning. Here is the trap. Everything just priced out is in the acquisition brochure. These are the costs every seller expects you to research. The ones that will determine whether you survive the first 3 years are the ones that never appear in the brochure. The Federal Trade Commission's funeral rule, enacted in 1984 and reviewed as recently as 2023, requires every funeral home to provide a GPL, a general price list, to any person who inquires in person. Every item must be individually priced. Package-only pricing is prohibited. Refusing to use a casket purchased by the family from an outside source is prohibited. Charging a handling fee for doing so is prohibited. Non-compliance triggers FTC enforcement actions starting at thousands of dollars per violation per occurrence. Specialized legal review of your pricing documents is not optional. It is an annual line item. Insurance runs deeper than new buyers expect. General liability coverage, professional liability for the handling and preparation of human remains, and commercial vehicle coverage for the fleet, combined, run somewhere between $18,000 and $40,000 per year for a standard 2-hearse operation. One family alleging mishandling of a loved one's remains, a misdirected cremation, an identification error, can exhaust that coverage entirely and generate legal costs that dwarf it. Now, here is where it gets dangerous. The cremation rate, the percentage of all deaths that result in cremation rather than burial, has climbed to somewhere between 57 and 63% nationally, according to the NFDA. Its own projections put that number above 78% by 2040. A direct cremation, no embalming, no viewing, no ceremony, the body collected and returned as ashes, runs somewhere between $700 and $2,100. A traditional full-service funeral with burial generates 3 to 4 times that revenue per call. If the cremation rate in your specific market shifts by 10 percentage points over the next 5 years, your per-call revenue drops materially, even if your total call volume holds flat. The staff, the building, the fleet, the insurance, none of those costs move with the cremation rate. They stay exactly where they are while your revenue per funeral quietly erodes. The asset that held up the independent funeral home P&L for a century is being compressed from below. Slowly, and then less slowly. Now let's map what actually comes in. The first revenue layer is at-need services, funerals arranged at the moment of death. A traditional full-service funeral with burial in the United States carries a median cost somewhere between $7,800 and $9,000, according to NFDA survey data. A cremation with viewing and ceremony runs between $2,500 and $5,000. A direct cremation falls somewhere between $700 and $2,100. Most homes see all three, with the mix tilting toward the lower end of that spectrum every year. The second revenue layer is merchandise, and this is where the margin structure becomes unmistakable. A casket sold at retail for $4,500 may have cost the funeral home $800 to $1,500 wholesale. The largest casket manufacturer in the United States is Batesville Casket Company, a subsidiary of Hillenbrand, Inc., which supplies a substantial portion of the industry's inventory. Urns, burial vaults, and memorial stationery add additional product lines at comparable spreads. The difference between what you pay at wholesale and what the grieving family pays at the counter is the merchandise margin, and it has historically been the widest margin in the funeral home P&L, somewhere between 200 and 400%. The third revenue layer is preneed contracts. A preneed contract is a funeral sold before anyone has died. A family walks in, selects services and merchandise, and prepays for the eventual funeral at today's pricing. A legally required percentage of that payment goes into a preneed trust, a state-regulated fund that holds the prepaid money until the service is delivered, and the funeral home commits to honoring the agreed price regardless of what has changed by the time the death occurs. For the independent home, preneed contracts are a retention mechanism. They lock in families who will not be in a position to shop for alternatives when the time comes. For the large corporate operator, preneed contracts are something else entirely. We will come back to that, because that is where the economics of this industry turn completely. The fourth layer applies only to the combination unit with its own retort. Owning a crematory in-house captures a per-cremation processing fee of $1,500 to $3,000 that would otherwise go to a third-party cremation service. At current cremation rates, a home processing 100 cremations per year retains between $150,000 and $300,000 in revenue it would otherwise route outside. A retort costs between $100,000 and $250,000 new. At those numbers, the math for a high-volume home is not complicated. So far, a funeral home with owned cremation capacity, strong merchandise margins, and a growing pre-need book sounds like a machine that runs quietly on guaranteed demand. Now here is the other side of the ledger. The merchandise margin is real, but the FTC funeral rule explicitly prohibits refusing a consumer-supplied casket and prohibits any handling charge for using one. Costco began selling caskets in 2004. Amazon entered the market. A family that purchases an $800 casket online and delivers it to your facility is exercising a federally protected right. The markup that anchored the independent home's P&L for generations is being compressed simultaneously by e-commerce and federal regulation. It is not going to zero tomorrow. It is going in one direction. Now go one layer deeper. Remember the pre-need contracts, the money families pay today for a funeral that has not yet happened? A legally required percentage of every pre-need payment sits in that state-regulated pre-need trust, earning investment returns until the death occurs. Here is the detail that changes the entire equation. Those investment returns belong to the funeral home operator, not to the family that paid. The industry term for this is float, the investment income earned on trust balances during the period between payment and service delivery. For an independent home managing a pre-need book worth $1 million, which is not unusual for a well-established operation doing 150 calls per year, The annual float at a 4% investment return is $40,000. Not from a single funeral, not from a casket sale. From money sitting in an account, compounding quietly every quarter, regardless of whether the phones ring. The casket is not the business. The float is the business. Now scale that to what Service Corporation International discloses in its publicly filed annual reports. SCI holds several billion dollars across its pre-need funeral and cemetery trust portfolios. At even modest investment returns, the float generates a revenue line before SCI has embalmed a single body, sold a single casket, or dispatched a single hearse. SCI is, in one precise financial dimension, a money management operation that happens to need a funeral home license to attract the capital it manages. And then there is the deepest layer. The terminal wealth move in death care is not running an excellent funeral home. It is building a pre-need book, establishing call volume, earning decades of local trust, and eventually selling to a consolidator at somewhere between 0.8 and 1.3 times annual gross revenue, with the locked-in trust assets transferred with the keys. Now here is what happens when you try to do all of that too fast. Ray Loewen grew up in Steinbach, Manitoba. He took over his father's small funeral home in 1961, and over the next 2 decades built it into a regional operation on a single thesis. The death care industry was fragmented, sentimental, and resistant to consolidation in ways that made it uniquely vulnerable to anyone disciplined enough to actually consolidate it. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, Loewen Group executed the most aggressive funeral home roll-up strategy in North American history. A roll-up is an acquisition model in which a large operator buys smaller independent businesses, trims shared overhead across the combined portfolio, and maintains local brand identities so no community realizes their neighborhood funeral home now belongs to a publicly traded corporation. The family portrait stays on the wall. The longtime staff stays at the front desk. Nobody outside the boardroom knows anything has changed. By 1998, Loewen Group operated approximately 1,800 funeral homes and 560 cemeteries across the United States and Canada. It was the second largest death care company on the continent. It looked from the outside like the future of the industry. The number that ended it was $500 million. In 1995, a Mississippi jury awarded funeral home and insurance operator Jerry O'Keefe approximately $500 million in damages, finding that Loewen Group had breached the contracts underlying its acquisition of Gulf National Insurance and funeral assets. Loewen intended to appeal. Mississippi law at the time required posting a bond of approximately $625 million to do so, a sum the company could not raise. It could not pay the judgment. It could not appeal it. There was no exit. Loewen Group filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in June 1999, carrying approximately $2.9 billion in total debt. It had financed its empire on high-yield debt, assuming that the synergies from the next acquisition would always cover the price of the last one. 1 jury, 3 weeks, 1 Mississippi courthouse. 15 years of aggressive growth collapsed under its own balance sheet. The company emerged from bankruptcy in 2002 as Alderwoods Group. SCI absorbed significant portions of the Alderwoods portfolio in 2006. Loewen Group was operationally functional the day it filed. The calls were being answered. The funerals were being conducted. The balance sheet was the weapon that killed it, not any failure in the funeral homes themselves. So who actually wins in this industry, and how does the wealth actually accumulate? The question planted at the beginning, whether a funeral home can build real wealth for its owner, has an answer. The mechanism just looks nothing like what the listing implies. Start with the land. A funeral home on a prominent corner of a residential neighborhood in a growing city is sitting on commercially zoned real estate that has typically been appreciating since the day the building was first constructed. The business and the property are priced together in the acquisition. The land's standalone market value is often a materially higher number, priced separately. Sophisticated buyers increasingly hold the real estate in a separate legal entity and lease it back to the operating company. When the operating business is eventually sold, the land stays. Layer in the float. Every pre-need contract signed builds a trust portfolio generating investment income regardless of what the operating year looks like. An established home with 30 years of pre-need book building can carry a portfolio generating somewhere between $60,000 and $100,000 in annual investment income that does not surface in the visible operating P&L, income that arrives whether the phones are busy or quiet. And at the exit, the consolidation premium. Large operators pay acquisition premiums for homes with established pre-need books because they are not acquiring a building or a local name. They are acquiring a portfolio of locked-in future revenue and the trust assets that accompany it. A pre-need book is, to a consolidator, exactly what an annuity block is to an insurance company. A predictable stream of future obligations attached to capital already collected, already compounding. The funeral was the vehicle, the trust was the destination. Now let's build a real scenario. A hypothetical independent funeral home in a mid-size American market, 175 calls per year, operating as a combination unit with its own retort. Good year. 70 full-service burials average $8,600 each. 55 cremations with ceremony average $3,400 each. 50 direct cremations average $1,400 each. Total gross service and merchandise revenue, approximately $958,000. Operating costs, a staff of 6 including 2 licensed directors, the facility lease, vehicles, insurance, embalming supplies, and annual regulatory compliance. Total $725,000. Net operating profit, approximately $233,000 before debt service. Great year. Bad year. A mild winter reduces total calls to 140. The cremation rate in the market climbs 12 percentage points, significantly fewer full-service burials, a surge in direct cremations at the lowest revenue per call in the portfolio. The retort fails in July. Cremations must be outsourced at $540 per service for 3 weeks while replacement parts arrive. A licensed director gives notice in September, and temporary coverage costs $18,000 through the end of the year. Gross revenue drops to approximately $438,000. Fixed costs do not flex. Total operating costs land at approximately $749,000. Net operating loss, approximately $311,000 before debt service. Rough year. The gap between those two scenarios is over $500,000, driven almost entirely by variables outside any operator's control. Local mortality rate, the rate at which families choose cremation over burial, and the reliability of one piece of industrial equipment. Those are not exotic risks. They are the ordinary, predictable risks of this specific business. What separates owners who build equity over decades from owners who sell in distress is not effort. Everyone in this industry works hard. It is cash reserves built deliberately during the good years, a cremation offering developed before the market forces the issue, and a pre-need book large enough to generate float income that keeps the operation solvent when call volume is thin. Come back to that building on the quiet residential street. The heavy curtains in the windows, the carefully maintained lawn. The address that has existed in every neighborhood in America for as long as neighborhoods have existed, which everyone knows has to be there, and nobody wants to think about until they do. What was sitting behind that facade was never simply a funeral home. It was a trust company with a chapel attached, a real estate position dressed as a service business, and at the end, for the owners who built it correctly and sold it at the right moment, a capital event that had nothing to do with how many funerals were conducted in any given year. The funeral home was never really in the funeral business.